My guest today, Iryna, conducted an interview with a UK volunteer working for a mission to evacuate civilians from Ukraine's front lines. Forging a human corridor under constant bombardment is only half the battle. It also takes enormous effort to convince civilians to leave. British photographer turned volunteer Ignatius Ivlev-Yorke and his team have evacuated thousands of Ukrainians to safer locations across Ukraine and abroad, and has explained the challenging operations to Iryna in an amazing interview recently. Well, we're going to put a link to that video in the description of this video, and we're going to discuss many other topics around the challenges of reporting this war, as well as these brave individuals that are operating close to or on the front lines. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. If you enjoy the material you create, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of the videos on YouTube to help other people discover our fantastic guests. Iryna Matviyishyn is a Ukrainian journalist and producer. Iryna is also a video reporter at the Kyiv Independent. She previously worked as a freelance journalist with various international media. She was also an analyst, a video producer, and a project coordinator at UkraineWorld. Iryna studied journalism in Lviv and holds a master's degree in human rights and democratization from the global campus of human rights in Europe. Iryna, I'm delighted to welcome you, and on a Saturday morning as well.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Well, let's start off by talking about Ignatius and his team, because this is an absolutely incredible video, which I strongly encourage everyone to watch. And as I say, there'll be a link in there. But how did that interview come about? And, what were your impressions of him and his team, who are literally saving civilians from the hell of Russia's war?
Thank you for appreciating my video and for your feedback. I decided to do this video because I've been following Ignatius and his team for a long time, and it was like I live in a war zone actually, because the whole Ukraine is being attacked by Russia, either by missiles or by drones. But still, like, for me, his work seemed like something extraordinary, because I know that I would maybe not have this much courage to risk my life for saving civilians at the front line and going to the worst areas of this war. And he's been doing that since last May, as far as I know. He's actually half Russian. His mom is from Russia, and he lived in Moscow before the full-scale invasion. But eventually he decided to come to Ukraine and help rescue civilians. And to him, it's something very natural. When I asked him about his motivation, he said that it's very rewarding, and that's what he can do best, and he knows that he can do it, and he feels like it's something normal, nothing extraordinary, but it's incredible work that they are doing. I don't know so many people who would risk their life on a daily basis to go to the front line. But of course, there are a lot of volunteers who do similar work and who are maybe less known because they don't post everything on social media, and as well as military and police who are rescuing and evacuating people. In this video, we inserted some abstract about children who are being evacuated by the Ukrainian police unit called White Angels. And this is like an evacuation department of police in the Donetsk Oblast, which undertakes evacuations of children from different embattled areas in the east. And they are doing incredible work too. But this is like an official team of people who are doing that. And that's their work. But someone coming from Moscow, or who could have lived in the UK and who could have enjoyed a peaceful life doing something else, when such people risk their lives to do this kind of things, it's even more impressive. So yeah, the interview was much longer than 14 minutes. It was about 40 minutes, but obviously we had to cut a lot of things, not to make it too long. But Ignatius said a lot of interesting things, like how they cooperate with military. Usually they work with the 93rd Brigade, who helps them to coordinate at the front line, because it's also very dangerous to go even like to the place where civilians live without knowing what's happening there, like where Russians are advancing, where like certain things could be mined and stuff like that. So they work with military closely, and they, like, the military helps them a lot. To sometimes they follow them to certain places. Like he sent me some videos from Soledar, I guess, when they were accompanied by Ukrainian snipers, because the area was so dangerous that they could be like shot at any moment. So they were literally like surrounded by Ukrainian snipers going on the road, like to the place where people lived. When fighter jets were flying over them and then hitting some targets. So it's a complete chaos, and it's like a real war that you can see on his Instagram even. So yeah, maybe you have some following questions that I can answer.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the interesting thing about it is, yes, you've got the danger, you've got the intensity, but also he's not simply going to the front line, getting people into the car and leaving. It's not a taxi service, because people who have remained close to the front lines, some of them he was describing have developed a kind of, I don't know whether it's called sort of Stockholm syndrome, or they've developed a mindset whereby terrible things might happen to my neighbors, but it's not going to happen to me, or they're holding out for the very last minute, or if they've become incredibly fatalistic, what happens will happen.
Yeah.
And some of them have even kept and hidden their children with them. So he has to go in, and in many cases he has to negotiate. And sometimes it's very difficult to negotiate with the older generation. He has to try and negotiate through the children to persuade the family to leave. Can you describe a little bit about that and these negotiation techniques, and even the psychology of some of the people who've remained near the front lines?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's something about war that makes people feel a bit reckless and sometimes even careless, because you're getting, like, the human beings are created this way that we tend to adapt to the situations we live in, even in the worst conditions. And we know it through history, we know it through current war in Ukraine, that's for people it becomes like part of their life. After some time, like the first few months maybe are shocking. That's what I observed being in Ukraine during the war. The first few months are shocking, and you're kind of in a distress. You're trying to process all that is happening and figure out how to live, how to move forward. But later, your brain kind of knows what is happening, so it just adapts your life and adapts your plans. I don't know, like your perception of the reality. And we notice it even being like a bit far away from the front line. But I see, like, for example, yesterday I noticed that all of my friends, when we meet, like I arrived to Kyiv just yesterday, but when I meet my friends, the first thing we start to talk about is like whether we heard an explosion, like during the night when there was an attack. How was it? Like, were you sleeping or did you wake up? But we talk about it in a way that it's not shocking anymore. It's just like part of our reality, you know. And last night I also wake up from, there was a drone attack on Kyiv. But I woke up and I was like in an underground hostel, so I took like minus ground floor, -1 floor, and I thought that I would be relatively safe when something hits, you know. But if you like distance yourself from like this kind of like participation in this reality, you think it's kind of crazy, like the way we talk about it. And it's the same happens with people close to the front line. The war in Ukraine started in 2014, so a lot of people lived near the front line, even though it was not that active as it is now. There were still fightings, civilians were killed, like throughout 8 years of Russia's war against Ukraine. Around 14,000 civilians were killed. So it's not that like few people, it's quite a big number. But people kept living there. I mean, a lot of people fled, but like these frontline towns and cities, they were still populated. Life was going on there, and even like in the last few years, they repaired the roads to these frontline cities to make them more like connected to the rest of Ukraine, because the roads in the east of Ukraine were terrible. And that created some kind of illusion that life was normal there. And I think like right now, a lot of these people, because they already knew what war was, they were not so far away as maybe like people in the west of Ukraine were, or in Kyiv. For some people, the war didn't exist because they didn't feel it. But these people felt like they felt the consequences of war. And when the full-scale invasion started, they just thought, okay, we're going to live that too, because we already endured a lot. So many have just decided to stay and to watch their property. And as Ignatius said, for Ukrainians, especially like for older people of maybe my parents' generation or my grandparents' generation, like your property and what you earned through life, what you gained through life as physical, I don't know, material, is very important to you. And the people are very attached to their houses, to their fields. Ukrainians are attached to their land historically and traditionally speaking. They like working on their land, and to them it's something natural that you should take care of the land and plant things and harvest and stuff like this. So like for people who are not of younger generation like me, or even like younger people who study, it's something like obvious that they should stay and watch what they gained throughout their life, because that's everything they have. And as Ignatius said, many of them haven't left to other parts of Ukraine. Many of them just stayed in their own village for their whole life, so they can't just leave. So yeah, and then war creates, like, if it's an ongoing war, it creates some kind of illusion that you're fine. Like, if you were not hit yet, you're fine. If it was like, if the neighboring house was hit, that means that it didn't hit you. You can still live there. It's just like a distortion of a reality, that you don't think that that it can actually kill you. And I think that's another argument why so many people stay, because they feel safe under their own roof. There's this illusion that your own house is something almost holy, that saves you from anything, that you're protected there, but it's not true. And that's why we have almost like we have on a daily basis, we have news that civilians were killed in Donetsk or Luhansk Oblast or in the south. So yeah, people just adapt. They think even if it's like the worst situation, even in Bakhmut, where they had to live in the basement for months and almost half a year, they think it's fine because they have water, because volunteers provide food. They think that they will endure it, and eventually that they will survive, but it just, I think that this, the fact that so many humanitarian organizations and volunteers help civilians in such dire conditions, I think that it kind of helps these people to stay there and ignore the dangers of this reality, and maybe endangers them even more, because Ignatius told me that he brought like toys and sweets to children who were a bit further from the front line. I think it's fine, but I think it's not fine when people when humanitarians encourage civilians to stay in the worst condition by bringing them everything they need, instead of like trying to persuade them to evacuate, trying to tell them that it's useless, like to somehow explain them that like the humanitarian aid will not rescue them, that they can be killed at any moment. Yeah, so it's a very heartbreaking situation, especially with children, when their parents trapped them in such dire conditions, and neither the police, neither the military, neither the volunteers can aid them, these children, because their parents do not agree to be evacuated. And according to the Ukrainian law, they have to be like accompanied by a legal representative, either a parent, and some parents just don't want to leave, and they have such a distorted perception of this reality that they don't realize how much they endanger their children. And that's why we also have a lot of casualties among children. There were some very heartbreaking stories when children were kept by their parents at the very front line, and volunteers were visiting them for some time to ask them to persuade their parents to leave. But eventually these children were killed in a strike. And that's something like, I don't know, like I and maybe a lot of like Ukrainians who follow the situation agree that these children have to be evacuated by force if their parents don't want to evacuate, because they basically put their life at risk, and these children have no choice. Many of them would like to go, but because their parents brainwash them to stay and like telling them that everything is fine, these children just get like emotionally and psychologically broken. Like you can't stay normal in this situation. So it's a very heartbreaking story.
And that's terrible for the future, isn't it? Because those children who survive this are going to have extraordinarily traumatic experiences, which even if they are, buried and little understood at the moment, those are going to emerge into adulthood. I mean, it's mental trauma is going to be the subject of another episode we're going to do soon, because as Ukraine edges closer towards victory, the subject of treating not just the mental trauma of children, but the entire civilian population and the military, that's going to be an urgent need, isn't it, after victory?
Yeah, but that's what we started to talk about in Ukraine. I mean, since the beginning of war, basically, because old people, like, it's a tremendous shock for your psychic to realize that your previous life just ended, like your normal life just ended, and you live in a war zone, and like a lot of lives were just destroyed. Not even like in terms of losses, like physical losses, either it's your property, or it's a relative, or like your loved one. A lot of people lost their loved ones either on the battlefield or as civilians, like living in peaceful cities. It's a tremendous trauma, but also like people who didn't lose anything physically speaking. Like I personally, I come from Western Ukraine. My family is fine, and my family still has work that they were doing before, have been doing before the war. but like something inside you just shifts because you know that it's not a normal life, and you know that like that at any moment one of you can die because like there are attacks everywhere. And your loved one goes to the front line, so you're constantly worried about it. Like my brother is at the front line currently. And even if you still have, like physically speaking, your life going on, you can work, you have a normal like daily routine, you still can hang out with your friends, but it's just like mentally speaking, it's a complete shift. And I think it took me maybe 6 months to finally like start accepting it as a reality, because like many times I would just like wake up and think it was not true. Like I would wake up in the morning and I think like, is it like for real? Like, are we living in a war? Like it was difficult to comprehend, and like the scale of tragedy, like of losses, has been so big that it's like your brain just can't process it. And I'm speaking as a person who's fine and who hasn't lost anyone close to me, thanks God. I know people who died, and I know, and I knew them like as my distant friends or my characters of my videos or articles that I've like been working with. But like still, like these losses, even though they are not like your loved ones or close family, it's a tremendous shock, because you just scroll your social media and you see people dying like on a daily basis. You see like your acquaintances, people you knew through social media, famous people, or I don't know, some colleagues of your colleagues, and it's just like accumulating. So of course, like mental toll of this war is probably incomprehensive yet. I spoke to one war trauma expert when I was in Sarajevo last year, and she works with Ukrainians, and she told me that different people like perceive these kind of things differently. So it doesn't mean that all of us would have PTSD. It doesn't work like that. Like some people are more resilient and some people are more vulnerable. Someone can live through the most horrible things and be fine, and someone can live like through, I don't know, an air raid and hear an explosion, and he will be, or they will be traumatized. So yeah, it's just, but of course, it's a huge impact. And even Ukrainians who evacuated, who lived through the first days of war in place like in Kyiv, or I don't know, in Bucha or Mariupol, who evacuated abroad and have been living abroad for more than a year now, they are still like hurt by this war. And the perception of everything that's going on around you is different. And I think it stays with you for years, or maybe even for life. Sometimes when I was writing on my Twitter about like how I get anxiety because of air raid alerts, even though like I can be in a relatively safe west of Ukraine, I feel like that I have anxiety when I hear it, because I don't know, just I can't explain it, because my brain realizes that I'm fine there. It's very unlikely that anything would fall or will hit my house, but still like my body reacts to it in this anxious way. And I know that Ukrainians who evacuated from like war-torn places, and who saw like who experienced the war in the first days, hearing planes or like huge explosions or other weapons, sounds of other weapons, they still cautious, and they still like can't react normally to fireworks or to, you know, like people who evacuated from Kharkiv or Mariupol. There were a lot of like cases that people were writing on social media that these people like were just falling on the ground because of the sound of the plane, and they had like panic attacks. So yeah, it's a huge impact on the civilians, and not only civilians but also soldiers and paramedics.
And another aspect of this, and it's one which is really only going to be resolved, I think, fully after the war has ended, and it's going to be a very difficult one. And that, of course, is what Russians have called the evacuation of children, what everyone else calls the abduction of Ukrainian children to Russian territory. We now know more and more about this, and of course, Putin and Belova have been indicted by the IOC for their actions in the kidnapping of Ukrainian children. But it's the sheer scale that is horrifying. And I still feel that this gets far too little press coverage. So if we could tackle this topic of the missing children, why Russia's doing this, how they're doing it, why the Western press really isn't getting to the bottom of this story and shouting it all the time, and how on earth is it going to be resolved?
I think I saw like relatively good coverage of this topic in the big media, but also I saw very bad coverage of this topic. I like the podcast, The Daily. I think it's called The Daily about Ukraine. It's a Telegraph. I really like this podcast, but I don't want to be mistaken. Either it's a Telegraph or New York Times. But anyway, I heard this podcast about the deportation of children. Yeah, about the deportation of children, and like the way it was shaped was very weird to me. They took some expert. I should have revised that case, because I even wanted to write a tweet about it. They took a person who wrote an article about this. They made like an interview for the podcast, but the way she was talking about it sounded like a bit like, I don't know, diminishing. They presented it like if it was nothing surprising or abnormal, like if it was not an act of genocide. And I really didn't like it, because these, like, usually they cover the war and try to call out the aggressor and call out name the atrocities, but this like illegal deportation of children is one of the worst crimes, because it actually amounts to genocide, because they are not only like deporting children, they are also keeping them there, and they try to re-educate them in a Russian way. And this forced re-education is based on Russia. They are brainwashing these children against Ukraine. And what happens later, Russia militarizes children. It's a known fact for years. Russia has been militarizing their young population, especially on the occupied territories, but also like those who were deported to Russia, to create like the future military to fight against Ukraine. And this is like a very planned strategy that Russia has been using for years. So to me, it was surprising that this podcast was was kind of ignoring this fact. And even though they were talking about the thing that it was like kind of amounting to genocide, it was presented in a way that it's unsure or is debatable. And that's what I don't really like, because like in the end, this shapes, like people focus on what's said after you said something. So if you say like, okay, some say it amounts to genocide, but in the end, nobody really knows because it's not proven. And in the end, people focus on the last thing that you said. And that's why when I write about like the war, that it's a genocidal war in Ukraine, people tell me, oh, but it's not proven that it's a genocide. You can't say, like, you can't use the word genocide for everything. I mean, it's not proven yet because they don't like use this term legally speaking, and it takes years. It can take years to identify it, to define it as genocide. But we see what is happening. And if you look through the cases, through the pattern of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, you can see that it's like putting ticks to almost all of these arguments that say that it amounts to genocide. So yeah, I think the problem with media that many of them do it just like because it's a hot topic. Many of them do it for sensation. The last interview of Vice with Maria Lvova-Belova is just like a horrible example how not to do an interview and how not to manipulate on such topics, because like it's not even about like that she couldn't do this, like the journalist couldn't do this interview. Of course she could. And as we all support the free press and freedom of expression, it's normal that they wanted to do this interview and they had an access and opportunity to do it. But if you're not ready, like if you're not following the topic, if you're not like digging into the issue for some time, if you don't understand how international law, international humanitarian law, and other things like conventions, international conventions work, it's better not to do this interview, you know, because like if you touch upon such a serious topic and you don't know how to cover it, you can do more harm than good. And eventually that's what happened with this interview with Maria Lvova-Belova in Moscow. She, like the journalist, Isabel, I think her name is Isabel, just was like trapped in a conditions set by Russians, and she couldn't like find a way out in terms of her questions to Maria Lvova-Belova. When she asked her like, "Are you a war criminal?" Like Maria Lvova-Belova just laughed and said, "I'm a mother," and she's like presenting herself as a saint, you know, and that's like the image they created around her, that she's a saint who adopts a lot of children to save them from whoever, from the Russian army, I don't know, who bombs Ukrainian cities, and she's just like a righteous priest. And Vice just agreed on underlining like this image of her without questioning like furtherly why you did this and this and this. It's like when she always found a justification for like some stupid justification from Russian propaganda, the journalist didn't try to confront it.
And do you think
express her propaganda?
And this is interesting because
Yeah.
I think this gets to the heart of why some reporting is relatively good and some is not so good. I watch Times Radio a lot, as well as many Russian sources, and there seems to be a pattern. You know, those journalists who consistently focus on the Ukraine topic and have a chance to do research, have a chance to read books and actually, you know, dive deeper into the topic, and who have more time perhaps to research the interview and come with very specific information, especially around, let's say, you know, the definition of genocide and specific laws that are being broken. Those tend to be better, but also it's a kind of positive loop. Those kind of interviewers will tend to get the right kind of guests, the kind of guests that actually themselves are more knowledgeable. who have more of a, say, activist or strong opinion about what's going on. On the other hand, you'll get more junior, perhaps, reporters, not given much time to prepare, and they come in with the sort of the left, right, is it this, is it that? They come in with this idea of needing to be balanced, and they don't ask actually questions that get to the heart of a problem. Do you think there's a problem in the very sort of structure and organization of how many media organizations work?
I think it's a very like common mistake, I don't know, or a problem within international media, that because they cover so many things in the world, especially with international media, they try to look unbiased and balanced, as you said. And like, if you can keep some kind of balance in a, I don't know, in a country where there's a civil war, and still, like, there's always the truth, and there's always like a more manipulative side, But like here, many journalists just ignore that it's an imperial conquest, like it's a colonial kind of war, and Ukrainians are oppressed people, that they are not fighting like between each other. Like Ukrainians are not fighting with Ukrainians, who suddenly became pro-Russian. That's like a misconception that's been around since 2014. Eventually, finally changed, even though it was very difficult to like persuade and like to tell many media that it's a wrong coverage till the full-scale invasion happened. It was not obvious. Like, people still fell into this trap of Russian propaganda and kept reaffirming these bad misconceptions about Ukraine and about this war. Eventually changed, but I think not all journalists, or like maybe it's on the media level, understood that it's a colonial war, and that it's not like, it's a different scale of conflict. It's not an internal conflict that many have covered before. What happened in Syria, in Afghanistan, or I don't know, in African countries. It's a completely different war, and it demands a different coverage. And there are straight I forgot the word, straight violations of international law. And so if you know that there's like an imperial war and there are strict violations of international law, you should dig into that law. You should like discover what it means, why Russia is like committing such and such crimes, why it's an aggressor, why like the ICC issued an arrest warrant, what genocide means. Like, I think many journalists don't put much effort to like educate themselves on the matters that are like central right now, and they just try to cover this war from the perspective of from the like standard pattern that they used to project on all other countries where the civil war happened, So they try to pretend that there's some kind of balance, not to look too biased, not to look like too pro-Ukrainian. But eventually they just like fall into the trap of Russian propaganda, because they don't dig into that like much. They are not like Ukrainian journalists who are following Russian propaganda all the time and who know like all their manipulative narratives that they use to convince the world that, oh, it's Ukrainians who are like, Ukrainians are Russians, so it's nothing abnormal that we try like to I don't know, help them or to take them to Russia and keep them there, Yeah, just like one thing, when I worked before the Kyiv Independent, I worked as a local producer with international media, specifically was a national public radio in America. And there were a lot of reporters who were coming to Ukraine to cover the war who've never been to Europe. Like, I don't know, maybe they went to Europe like as I don't know, tourists, but they never covered Ukraine. They never covered Eastern Europe. They didn't know much about what was happening before. Some of them didn't know anything about Ukraine. And like when I saw them trying to cover like serious topics that actually impacted the opinion of Americans about Ukraine in general, I was like, dude, like maybe you should first dig into like read Wikipedia and like dig into Ukrainian history, understand that Ukrainians were fighting against Russian colonization for centuries, that Ukrainian nationalism like has been ongoing for a century to actually gain freedom and independence. And then maybe like, I don't know, try to educate yourself a bit, you know? So eventually my work at the beginning was just like trying to explain Ukraine to these people. And that's like pretty, how do you say, pretty risky situation, because if you don't get a good local producer who doesn't know much about Ukraine, or who doesn't like know history, or who hasn't been following political, social and cultural life in Ukraine much, you won't get like good background for covering this war. And I think it's important to understand like the time of how things were developing and how Russia was instrumentalizing Russian language, Russian culture in Ukraine to erase Ukrainian identity and things like this. It's everything is important. It's not just about like missiles flying and civilians being killed. It's a context that you should understand.
And this is very much an informational war. Yes, as you say, there are missiles. There's an extraordinarily long front line. There is a scale of physical fighting that really you can, only go back to World War II to see, similar kind of intensity, certainly in urban warfare that we're seeing in Bakhmut and other places. Nonetheless, Russia pours a vast amount of resources into informational warfare, disinformation and propaganda. I think it's very obvious to those who have, looked into the detail of this, or who even, like myself, can actually listen to Russian sources as well, Russian opposition sources. You start to build up a picture, and you start to sense when someone is saying something which may be wrong, but it's something they're trying to formulate, or when they say something wrong and they're actually reproducing a propaganda trope or a phrase or a concept that's clearly been designed to weaponize.
Yeah, I think that's...
You've looked into disinformation, you've looked into propaganda narratives extensively, in your reporting and work. And, in the last part of the interview, I really wanted to focus on, what are those current narratives that you still see popping up in the media? What narratives is Russia trying to use? Because we've seen different narratives in different countries, different narratives in Ukraine, in the East and the West, and we've seen those narratives evolve through the course of the war. They're constantly testing new messages. So what should we be aware of right now?
Well, there are a lot of things, starting from referendums. So when like most of the media, I think, didn't dare to put brackets when Russia announced its referendums, so-called referendums in the occupied territories, and big international media just wrote like referendums are happening, but these are just like fake. Like it's not just, it doesn't even look like referendum. It's like a total fraud. They were just like taking soldiers and people, some weird people, to go from flat to flat in occupied territories and ask people to put a tick like to vote for a referendum. It was a complete farce, and it was very shocking that so many media did not understand like that there can be no elections on the occupied territory by the occupying force under like the the machine gun, you know, like when the soldier comes to you with a machine gun, of course you will vote. Or like many people were just like hiding in their flats with closed door. But still, I saw this, like, I wrote about it, about these referendums, so-called referendums in occupied territories, because it was a very, very weird thing to me that people who were covering Ukraine for quite some time were still falling into that trap, not distinguishing like real democratic process from this farce that was happening in the occupied territories of Ukraine. And we've talked about these illegal deportations, which many media still called evacuation because Russia said so. So, like, the thing is that many media just try to cover what Russia says, and that's especially true for French and Italian media. They are very prone to like reiterating Russian narratives and Russian propaganda. It's quite toxic, like the media environment there. Like famous news outlets / radio RFI in France, I remember that vividly. They were just like saying that Moscow authorities are evacuating civilians, Putin said that they will be safe and stuff like this. But like they didn't even try to oppose it to what Ukraine said, and they didn't even try to explain like in what context this was happening. So it looked like, the news looked like it was really an evacuation of civilians from the dangerous zone, and Russia is kind of like a good savior, you know. But that's just like, I don't know, I think it's ignorance of journalists, and I think it's unprofessionalism because they don't try to learn the context of what they are writing about. And that's basically giving a platform to Russian propaganda, to the Kremlin, because that's what they want the world to believe. They want the world to believe that they are righteous saviors, that Ukraine is endangering civilians by keeping them there, by bombarding cities that they just came to liberate. And not even putting brackets to these words, or like not giving like the opposite view of the reality is very dangerous. And it's not like just words, it's just shaping people's perception. It impacts the assistance Ukraine gets, like the support of Ukraine in the world, and eventually it impacts the civilians on the ground. Like if we don't have enough weapons, if we don't have like protective air defense, we are screwed here, and more civilians die. So that's a direct connection to what media write, how they shape the public opinion. Thanks God, we don't see terminology like civil war anymore. That's that's a good thing. But for example, like in the interview of Maria Isabel Young from Vice, there was when she was explaining like that Russia deported children from the occupied territory and from annexed Crimea. That's also like a wrong terminology, because Russia wants to say that it was an annexed territory that returned to its historical cradle, but eventually this is just like occupied territory, and it's illegally taken territory. It's not like just annexed, you know. So yeah, these are small things, but they remain in your mind, like somewhere in the back of your mind. And if you think about Ukraine, you don't know much. You just use this terminology, and that's what shapes your perception. We can still see like Russian. Wait, let me think about it. Like Kherson, or I don't know, some other occupied territories when they were occupied, about their authorities, so-called authorities. These are not real authorities. These are just like Russian installed proxies, like people who are there illegally, and some media presented them as if where they were real administration, you know. So yeah, it's just a lot of things that Ukrainians keep saying like about, like it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong, but so many media just keep ignoring it, and especially like, I mean, it's Reuters, for example, it's like a constant thing, but it's connected to TASS, and I think they're quite like pro-Russian in their terminology,
Reuters is one of the
and
worst,
this
isn't
doesn't
it?
change.
I mean, I
But
constantly find myself getting triggered by
but
Reuters.
yeah, but yeah, but also some other media like French media fall into it, AFP, RFE, Washington Post falls into this trap. For example, like lately, they said that that Prigozhin had connection to Ukraine, and that's like where I don't remember exactly what it was, but eventually they said they got some intelligence leaks about like Prigozhin and Ukraine and Russian like militias helping Ukraine, stuff like this. But like publishing this information is obviously sensational, but it doesn't make any good, you know. And I sometimes we just don't understand why they publish it. Is it only like for being sensational? Okay, but what do you by it? Like you just like maybe you just play into Russian propaganda, and it's just like a subtle thing, but to us it's kind of obvious, but it seems like to big media it's not always obvious, even though they have like on the ground correspondents who are always here, but still they do these stupid things that discredit like all the work, like that undermine the work of Ukraine to resist to the Russian aggression.
And one of the big narratives that Russia is pushing and has been pushing for a few months is as they start to realize that defeat is becoming more and more likely, then of course the propaganda narrative is going to carry on with this idea that Russia is too big, you can't defeat Russia, or what comes after Putin is going to be far worse than Putin, as if that's actually possible. And they're going to be using propaganda to push for a negotiation and a truce that's beneficial to them, the aggressor, with a view to potentially, you know, restarting this aggression in a few years' time. So where do you see the propaganda shifting? Because it always aligns with what Russia's interests are. It always aligns with some strategic objective.
Yeah, that's another topic that is like constantly on the, how do you say, constantly disturbs Ukrainians, trying to explain that, look, this war can't be ended by negotiations because Russia doesn't negotiate, doesn't want to negotiate. And for them, negotiations mean to give some territories of Ukraine to Russia. So it's basically a concession. And like some foreigners saying that it's like fine to concede some territories, that it's nothing grave. I doubt that they would be willing to concede their territories, like let's say France or I don't know, the US. But for some reason, like they don't see Ukraine as an international actor, like they don't see Ukraine as a player on an international ground. They see it as a toy, I don't know, as something that you can agree on, or that's something that you can decide for, you know. It's very irritating for Ukrainians, and I think this year we've kind of like convinced a lot of people that Ukraine can decide for itself, and we are willing to fight, and we are going to end this war by winning this war, whatever it takes. So many people understood that, but I think like for people maybe within a bit of imperial mindset, like who come from former empires, like I don't know, France or the US, maybe not the empire, but was still with a bit of imperial mindset, or maybe like the UK, it's a bit difficult to comprehend that a small country can decide for itself, and That's what Ukrainians are trying to explain. They don't understand that they are falling into the propaganda narrative about they think that that's their peacemaking mindset, that would be better for Ukrainian civilians. But Ukrainians know for sure that this like if we concede territories and like Russia will take some part of like eastern southern Ukraine and we will just leave it like that and then live peacefully, that's a complete misconception. I think these people just should read more what was happening on the occupied territories in Ukraine when Russia was there, like in Kherson region, in Kyiv region, mass graves, I don't know, huge torture, like a lot of torture chambers, thousands of civilians who went missing, who were tortured, who were kidnapped, I don't know, raped and stuff like this. It's just like so thousands of war crimes, and you could be like abducted and killed for nothing, like just having, I don't know, a Ukrainian symbol at home, or just like knowing, speaking the Ukrainian language to your neighbor, you would be treated like a traitor, you know. I don't know why for so many people it's difficult to understand that Russia is a colonizer, that it wants to erase Ukrainian identity, how it has been doing for centuries. And I think many just don't link this narrative about peace negotiations to what Russia is trying to present to the world. Russia wants the world to think that it's a peacemaker, and meanwhile secede more, take more territories of Ukraine. So to the world, it says that we are saving, we're liberating these territories, and we're just going to be like fine there. We're just going like to put our flag and give like jobs and like just like make these people more like Russian, but everything is going to be fine. We're just like liberating our own regions where people mostly speak Russian, which is also not true. But on the other side, like when they are saying this to the world, but meanwhile they are conducting genocide. And I think it's a very dangerous, like this peacenik mindset that people who say, oh, we just want peace, let's just live in peace, let's love each other, let's just end the war. They don't know how to end the war, but they want to end the war so that like nobody shoots, but they don't care what happens after. But what Russia is doing meanwhile and will do if this happens is genocide. So it doesn't make any sense to say that we will end the war by just like the war will end if they just stop shooting, you know. To us, the war ends when we just like move them out of Ukraine, when we will kick them out and liberate our territories and our people. That's it.
And then, of course, kick them out and ensure that you are armed to the teeth to keep them out. I think that's the crucial thing. Kick them out and keep them out, and keep educating the world about what Russia is, what its intentions are, because its propaganda is extremely pervasive.
Yeah, I think many people also don't understand if Russia like takes more territory, that it means that it will prepare furtherly for further occupation. So it's not by random choice that they decided to take Kyiv. Their plan was to take the whole of Ukraine. Their plan, they thought, they didn't estimate Ukraine well. They know nothing about Ukraine for some reason, which was very surprising, that their intelligence was completely wrong. And they thought that Ukrainians would just give up and like accept Russia, you know. So their plan was just to take the whole of Ukraine, and it doesn't mean that by kicking them out from Kyiv that they don't want this anymore. If they occupy like a bit of the east of Ukraine and a bit of the south, they will be preparing for more. So this will by no way in no way it will end the war. It will just like prepare the ground for further escalation, for further war, and it will just like have an even bigger toll in the future. And that's what happened with Crimea and Donbass. That was a big mistake of European politicians who, especially like Merkel, who pushed for these Minsk agreements and who asked Ukraine not to shoot, like just leave it like this. They will be just like some kind of a frozen conflict. Nothing will be moving, will be fine, just a gray zone. But in the end, we just helped Russia to prepare for this full-scale invasion. I mean, eventually it helped Ukraine to prepare too, because we didn't have a real army to fight. Back in 2014, Ukraine had no army because of Yanukovych and the former government. They just destroyed our army, basically. They sold all the weapons to Russia and gave up on the fleet in Crimea. There was only a Russian fleet there. So, but it gave us some time and opportunities to prepare, and that's why our army was so like fighting so well, because it had like 8 years. But like speaking of Russia's plans, it helped basically for them to invade, to start this full-scale invasion.
And the work you're doing is incredibly important. I know we sort of come to the end of our time exploring these topics, but Iryna, I strongly advise people to check out your videos and your articles, and to regularly reference the Kyiv Independent, because it's much more important, I think, for people to get sort of knowledge from people who are on the ground, who understand the local history. And in no way is the Kyiv Independent sort of biased or nationalistic. It's an incredibly detailed newspaper. It's often far more critical of Zelensky, his government, his officials, than any stories you'll see in the Western media. And I feature it very heavily in the sort of weekly updates of the news we do as well. Yeah. I think it's incredibly important. And again, there's another newspaper called Moscow Times, run by, you know, a mixture of expats who remarkably still report on some of the nuances happening within Russia. And I strongly advise people to look at these local news sources that run incredibly detailed explorations of what's happening, and have this sort of firsthand sort of witness aspect to it. Well, thank you so much, Iryna. I know you're calling us from a cafe, and you're in the field, as it were, and it's difficult. So I greatly appreciate you spending so much time.
Thank you so much. I really wanted to say that the Kyiv Independent has a very good coverage, and that's the reason why I agreed to work there. Because my plan was to stay an independent journalist after I quit local producing, but one of my friends works at the video department, and she invited me, and eventually I agreed, because I knew that the Kyiv Independent is doing a great work, and they are very critical towards everything, and if there's something bad happening internally speaking in Ukraine, they would always cover it. We would always cover it. And there are a lot of investigations which are not portraying Ukraine in a good light, but we think it's important to speak about everything, because eventually what we are fighting for is freedom and democracy, and the rule of law. And that's what all Ukrainians are fighting for. We want to be like a democratic country with transparent systems, and eventually we need to talk about things that are not so rosy, you know. So like we can't look at everything with pink glasses. So yeah, I just invite everyone to read our stories, to watch our videos. Please subscribe to our YouTube. That's what I'm working on. And thank you for following Ukraine, and for your channel as well, that you're covering Ukraine on a constant, on a regular basis.